Alright guys, welcome to another episode of the Diabesity Planet. Today is day 7 of a 30-day continuous fast. So for today, I guess I'll start off with weight and waist circumference measurements. So for waist circumference measurements, I'm super happy to be down to about 100 centimeters on my waist. Again, I started at 106, so I'm down about 6 centimeters for my waist so far. So I hope I can hopefully maintain that and bring that even lower. In terms of my weight, though, it's actually up a little bit. It's about 198 pounds today. So it could be that my the water weight is sort of plateauing off, and also, I guess, to be quite honest, as I mentioned yesterday, I have been cheating slightly. Again, because of different situations that I thought it was better to just eat a little bit rather than not continue to abstain. So, but again, as yesterday's message was, the point is to keep going. And the great thing about the fasting diet is you can always, pick up the slack and fast off any kind of food intake that you regret, as in my case. So, so that's that. In terms of and again, it's about a week in, and again, I feel great. I feel my energy's up. Able to get all my work done. I've been having more bone broth lately, so no more headaches, no more feeling lightheaded or anything like that. In terms of the topic for today, so yesterday I said that today I'd talk a little bit about measurements and which measurements are kind of important and for what reason and what purpose. So I guess I'll divide the measurements today in terms of sort of objective body measurements from the outside, and then also I'll talk a little bit about blood measurements and things like that. So in terms of measurements as a whole, really what you're looking for is you're looking for a surrogate marker of how much fat you have on board, and to be able to quantify that in a meaningful way so that you know where you are in terms of the spectrum of obesity, and to give you a good measure of that. So I'll start off with a very common one. The most common one that's used in medicine is called the BMI, or the body mass index, and this is simply a formula where you divide your weight in kilograms by the square of your height, right? So if you were 170 centimeters, you divide 170 centimeters divided by, let's say you weigh 80 kilograms, you do 80 squared, so 80 times 80, and then you divide the 170 into that number, and that would be your BMI. So in terms of the range of BMI, normal BMI would be anywhere from roughly 20 to 25, and so normal BMI would be anywhere between 20 and 25, and being below 20, and especially being below 18, would be considered a low BMI. So perhaps you're too starved or your weight is too low. And then between a BMI of 25 and 30 would be considered in the overweight category. Above 30 you'd be in the obese category, and they've even subdivided that so that if you're over 35, between 35 and 40, you'd be severely obese, and then over 40, I believe, is morbidly obese. So again, sort of just rough classifications. Now BMI, as far as I'm concerned, in my experience, it's generally an okay tool to use. The only issues, or the times you run into issues with the BMI, is mainly because the weight that you're calculating, that could be due to muscle, or it could be due to bone, let's say, if you're big boned, or it could be due to fat. So the problem with the BMI is it doesn't really differentiate much between what goes into that weight calculation, because if you have a guy who has more fat on him, and his BMI is high, and you use that as a surrogate for fat, that would be great. But the problem is, if you run into bodybuilders or people with a lot more muscle on board, you'll end up with a higher BMI, even though they're not necessarily obese per se. They just got a lot more muscle mass. So that's where you run into some trouble with the BMI, and that's why so sometimes it's criticized for not being an accurate marker for body fat, and especially the harmful body fat. So having said that, we'll move on to the next measurement. And actually, also while we're on the topic of BMI, so my BMI before starting this 30-day fast was 31.1. So I was in the obese category, and I'm sure it was even higher than that, a couple of months ago. So definitely working towards bringing my BMI down from 31 and change, so from the obese category to hopefully under 25. Hopefully by the end of this 30-day fast, but if not, then anytime within the next couple months. So that's BMI. The next measurement is known as the waist circumference. And the waist circumference, the best way to measure it is basically you take a tape measure that's sort of bendable like this, and you basically put it over the widest part of your waist, or your tummy, I guess you could say. Not really your waist actually, because it's your it's called the waist circumference, but it's usually you can put it anywhere above or below your belly button essentially, and you want to basically put it around the widest part and take that measurement. So for guys, having a waist circumference over 102 centimeters is considered obese, and for women it's about 88 centimeters. So and again, this is sort of general numbers. Obviously, it depends on the race and culture. A lot of people say now that if you're part of at-risk groups, so South Asian or Asian, Oriental Asian, they have even shorter cutoffs for men. So I think the cutoffs is like 92 for so the World Health Organization, I think, has published different measurements, but essentially the important point is that waist circumference is probably a much better measurement of harmful fat than is BMI, because it directly measures how much adiposity you have in your waist, and that area is generally known to be harmful for there to be fat in that area. So that's probably a much better measurement again, and it's fairly easy to do as long as you have the tape measure. So if you don't have one, I strongly recommend getting one. You can sort of get it at any sort of health store or anything like that, or you can get it online, like on Amazon. They're really cheap, like $2-3. And again, in terms of my own waist circumference, that's something I'm tracking every day, and I'm posting underneath the YouTube videos. So essentially, I started with a waist circumference of 106 centimeters, and now I'm down to about 100 centimeters. So I'm down about 6 centimeters, which is pretty remarkable. And technically, since it's under 102, I'm out of the obese range, so that's great. The next measurement we'll talk about is body fat percentage. Actually, there's another one I didn't talk about, but that's called the waist to hip ratio. So you can also take the waist circumference and then take the circumference or the measurement of the hips, and that would be basically going around your buttock and measuring the widest area, and then taking a ratio between your waist circumference and your hip circumference. And basically the idea is your waist to hip ratio should be below 1, meaning that and I think it's well below 1. I think it's below 0.7. So in fact, your basically the diameter that's around your stomach should be less than the diameter around your hips. So essentially, your hips should be bigger than your waist in terms of your abdominal girth. So that's also a very good measurement as well, and that's good to do. Unfortunately, I'm not really doing it for my purposes, but that's also a very good surrogate, and it's probably just as good as the waist circumference. The next one is body fat percentage. So body fat percentage is essentially what you're going for. It's on the money. You want to know how much percentage of your body is fat. And again, The reason is because having more fat on board makes you more at risk for cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, things like that, as well as diabetes, general inflammation, etc. So it's a body fat that you want to get rid of. And so it's great if you can actually figure out what your body fat percentage is. Now, how do you figure out what your body fat percentage is? It's actually a fairly difficult thing to get at. So there's a number of different calculations and using calipers and things like that. There's even these monitors. I actually purchased one from Amazon, but I'm returning it because I think it's quite garbage, to be quite honest. So this is called the fat loss monitor. So this uses bioimpedance, or basically uses electricity. So you put your hands on these metal plates and you put in a bunch of other data like your weight, like your weight, your height, all that kind of stuff. And then it basically gives you a readout. So the readout it gave me was 24% body fat, which is absolutely incorrect. And what I used to validate that was another tool that I think is probably the best tool to give you a good idea of your body fat percentage. And I'll tell you why in a second. But that's called the DEXA Scan. And the DEXA Scan, it stands for Dual X-ray Absorptiometry. And basically, it's mainly used in people over the age of 50, 60 to measure bone density. And so it's typically used for that. But it can also be used to give you a good readout of bone, muscle, water weight, things like that. And actually, there's a clinic in Toronto. It's called the Bone Wellness Center. It's at 8855 Broadview. And they're one of the only clinics in Toronto that will offer this service of actually measuring your body composition, so how much of it's fat, how much of it's muscle, and it's actually quite phenomenal. So I'm not sure how much of this you can tell, but this was my readout, and it actually, the orange there is fat, and the bone there, the bone is sort of the light blue, and then darker blue is muscle. So when you go there, it takes about 10 minutes or even less. And you actually, a scanner just goes from head to toe and measures everything, and they give you quite a few really helpful tidbits of information. So for me, according to the machine, I weighed about 203.6 pounds. Again, this was about a day or two into my fast, and my body fat percentage, according to this, was 38.0. So 38% of my body was just fat, and it actually gave me that even in pounds. So it was 74.4 pounds of the 203.6 pounds is body fat, and then my lean muscle is about 121.4. So I do have a good amount of lean muscle, which is great. And so again, it was really nice to actually see this in full color and all the numbers and telling you all this information, because it was a big wake-up call for me and give me even more motivation to want to do this fast, seeing that my body fat percentage is so high. Again, there's also a whole bunch of literature about what would be a normal body fat percentage, and I'm happy to post some links to show what the average normal range is. But my goal personally is to get from 38% to hopefully somewhere between 10 and 20%. Hopefully maybe the magic number would be like 15%. So that's the beauty of the DEXA Scan, and I encourage, if any of you are curious about your body fat composition or think that it might give you a good wake-up call to do it and see it in color, to see how much of your body inside has fat all over it, I would recommend you to do it. And you may or may not be in for a shock or a surprise like I was. So we talked about those now. So that basically covers all the out of the body sort of measurements that you can do. The next set of things that I'm going to talk about is blood monitoring. So the different blood tests that have been used, or that are important in measuring things like risk factors with relation to obesity and diabetes. Probably the biggest one and the most important one in the context, especially in the context of diabetes, is the hemoglobin A1C. The hemoglobin A1C is basically a measurement of how much sugar is bound to your hemoglobin. And hemoglobin usually lasts for typically about 90 days, is the life cycle of a typical red blood cell. And so the A1C gives a rough sort of estimate of how your sugar control has been over the last 30 days. Over the last 90 days. So it gives us more of a measure of long-term, sugar management. And the way it works is if you have too much sugar in your blood, then that sugar is going to bind to the hemoglobin and give you a higher A1C level. Now, normal A1C level is below 6.0. Anything between 6.0 and 6.5 is considered prediabetes, and everything above 6.5 is considered over diabetes. Now, so this is something that's measured, and again, the goal of fasting in somebody with diabetes is to help bring down their A1C, well below 6.5 and hopefully below 6. And the lower, the better. And even for people who are doing weight loss, it's still not a bad idea to get a sense of your A1C to see how much sugar is sort of circulating, and use that as a target to try to lower that as much as you can. That'll give you an idea of how good and how low your sugar levels are. So that's A1C. The next one is something called fasting insulin, and to be honest, I didn't know that insulin could be measured, and it can be used as a marker for how much insulin resistance you have. So again, diabetes and obesity is caused by having too much insulin on board, and that it leads to insulin resistance, leads to weight gain, and as well as insulin resistance, and then leads to obesity and diabetes. So if you have more insulin on board and more insulin in your blood, you can actually measure that by taking a fasting insulin level. And many of the patients in the intensive dietary management program have this level measured. And roughly ballparking it, a really good measurement would be under 20, because ideally you want your fasting insulin level, the number of insulin circulating in your body, to be as low as possible. The lower your insulin level, the less likely you are to have diabetes, and less likely you are to gain weight, and the more likely you are to be healthy, right? So you want your fasting insulin to be as low as possible. So unfortunately, I haven't done my A1C or my fasting insulin, so I can't really comment too much. But again, your goal for the fasting insulin would be to get it under 20. A lot of people, the average person, might have it in the hundreds, even 200s, 300s. So that's another important measurement. The other ones have to do with your lipid profile, and that means how much triglycerides, LDL, and HDL cholesterol you have on board. So what's the relationship between triglycerides, LDL, and HDL? And this could be a whole topic on its own, but basically, when you talk about fatty acid metabolism, anytime you have sugar on board, your body basically takes in the sugar, and whatever's left over, your liver starts to produce triglycerides from that, and then triglycerides are released into the body in the form of VLDL, which gets transferred to LDL, and LDL is known as the bad cholesterol, or the cholesterol that makes you more likely to have a heart attack and a stroke. So LDL is a good measurement for cardiovascular risk, and that's something that's often done in blood work for people with diabetes and obesity and cardiovascular risk factors. And then triglycerides, and along with that, HDL is the high density lipoprotein, and that's the good cholesterol. So that's the cholesterol that keeps your bad cholesterol lower and keeps you healthy, and sort of mops up all the other bad cholesterol. So the goal of fasting would be to increase your HDL and decrease your LDL. And lastly would be your triglycerides. So triglycerides is basically a measure of your stored fats. So the lower your triglycerides, the better. So again, this would be a measurement that you would do, and that you could do through your blood work, and that you'd want to see to be slowly go down with as time progresses with your fasting. So that's the summary today of some of the measurement tools. If you have any questions or comments, please comment below, and I'm happy to answer them for you. And thanks again for listening. Thanks again for all your suggestions. Tomorrow I might talk a little bit, actually I might backtrack and talk a little bit about what my motivations are and why I chose to do this this continuous fast. And then the following day, hopefully, I'll also talk about some more details about what the fast actually entails in terms of the food content, the liquid content, and why we use that. So stay tuned, and looking forward to having you participate and observe the next videos coming up. And please feel free to subscribe and send me some likes as well if you like the videos. And please share them if you find they're helpful for you and anybody else. Thanks again. Take care. Until next time, Dr. Furmli.